Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Threat Hunting for New and Experienced Hunters, panel discussion of the SANS 2019 Threat Hunting Survey, sponsored by Domain Tools, ExtraHop, and ThreatConnect. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Josh Lemon and Matthias Fuchs, both are SANS certified instructors, and Matt Cawthorn, VP Sales Engineering, Security Evangelist at ExtraHop, and Alex Valdivia, Threat Intelligence Research Lead at ThreatConnect, and Taylor Wilkes-Pierce, Senior Sales Engineer at Domain Tools. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Josh.
Thank you very much, Carol, and welcome everyone to today's webcast. So just a reminder that Matt and I also got the chance to go through some of the results from the threat hunting survey that we were lucky enough to get the chance to author this year together. So there's a recording from that from yesterday's webcast. So just a reminder, if you did miss that, then that recording is available on the SANS website. You can go and have a watch of it. If you did join us yesterday, then welcome back again today. It's really great to have you here again. And if you're a little bit new to the SANS threat hunting survey report that we've managed to do, we're going to go over just a couple of key results. And the idea behind that is just to kind of set the tone a little bit for those of you who have joined us for the first time today, and then just a bit of a reminder for those of you who have come along from yesterday's webcast as well, and just to remind you of some of the things that we started to see in the overall results that came out of the survey, just so we set the tone a little bit for what we're going to be doing with the panel session today. So with that, we're just going to go through some of the key things that that Matt and I pulled out of the results that we saw from this year's survey from all of our respondents. One of the key things, and we spoke about this yesterday as well in a lot more detail, but one of the key things that we see is that at the moment we're seeing that organizations are kind of giving our threat hunters the role of threat hunter, but then also giving them other roles as well inside the organization. So we're seeing about 34% of those respondents saying that they are threat hunters as well as managing SOC alerts. We're also seeing that 26% of them are doing that role of threat hunting, then also investigating incidents or breaches. This is most likely your CERT or your CSERT or your incident response type teams. And then 14% of the respondents were saying that they were doing that threat hunting role, and then also doing things over in design, security infrastructure as well. Now, one of the things we mentioned in the report is just around doing this can often lead to some interesting conflicts with different roles that people might be doing all at the same time. And one of the key ones there is where you have people who are threat hunting inside an environment. They've developed their hypothesis. They begin the threat hunt that they've decided to do, and then all of a sudden they come across something which is highly suspicious or highly or high potential to be malicious as part of the hunting that they've found. And in the role where they're doing something along the lines of being a threat hunter as well as investigating incidents or breaches, the mistake we see people make is that they're hunting and then all of a sudden they turn into this incident responder to enact incident response inside the organization. And the risk or I guess sort of thing that can go wrong there is that you don't usually complete the hunt at that point. You kind of found something and then you go into this incident response mode, and maybe there is more to this incident that you just haven't uncovered yet, or maybe there's actually another incident entirely different which you just haven't gotten to yet as part of that threat hunt. So that's what we're seeing with the respondents, that they're doing those two roles together. And then we did have 29% of respondents that came in through the report this year say that threat hunting, that they had a formal program and they had specifically assigned staff to do this, which is really where you want to end up with your threat hunting, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through some of the panel sessions as well. But that was one of the big callouts that we're seeing overall in the survey, and I'll hand over to Matt to kind of pick up the other points as well that we noticed.
Right, as Josh pointed out, we were very delighted to do that survey, and I think it was sort of enlightening to us which kind of results came back. So as Josh also pointed out, we had 29% of the respondents who have threat hunting coined into a well-defined program within their organization. But we also had 43% of the respondents who just conduct threat hunting on an ad hoc basis. So we had responses like, okay, we do it when we find some time, which is usually never, and things like that. So I think they're just on the brink of getting that into a real program, and I think that's where they are headed. The very interesting part here is we saw that 7% outsource it to a third party. It would be interesting to understand if the third party is a third party only doing threat hunting, or if it's a third party that's already engaged in that network, like an external outsourcing provider, like an external SOC or whatever. Because in that case, it makes sense. If you come only on site for threat hunting, it might be challenging because you just don't know what's normal in the network and what's not. The very good part about this survey was that 42% stated that they have dedicated hunters. So I think the team size depends on the size of the organization, but at least they do have dedicated hunters, which is great. And I think it's a development from last year and 2 years ago. So very interesting there. And I think we should go to the questions. Let me click here. Question number 1, and we do have some numbers that lead into that question. Oops, that was the wrong direction. Sorry for that. The question generally, does your organization perform threat hunting? And we have the responses there. And as you can see, the majority of respondents, they do have threat hunting in place, but in an ad hoc process. So what you can see there is that basically the majority number here is shifting through all of those answers. So we do have only 30%, around 30% that have the formal program yet, but I think that will change a lot next year. And I think we'll come to that and get some more opinions on that from our panelists here. When you are not having any dedicated threat hunters, then the question is, what else do those people do? Because what they do as well basically influences on how they do threat hunting, because they might switch roles during the hunt, as Josh pointed out. As you can see, the vast majority is managing SOC alerts, which sort of makes them SOC analysts. And the second largest number goes up into incident response, and then we also have architecture roles and so on. And some are even system administrators. So that, I think, leads us to the question there. The question is, are you seeing threat hunting as a defined role or just as a function of security? Is it even possible to do it only as a function of security? If an organization considers it just a function of security, how do you find time for proactive hunting? And I might hand over to Taylor. Taylor with Domain Tools. So what's your take on that?
Hey, thank you. First off, always great to work with the SANS team. Definitely look forward to the survey coming out. Always a font of useful information for us here at Domain Tools. And I'll tackle this, it's a couple of questions here, so we'll tackle them. Are we seeing threat hunting as a defined role or just as a function of a security team? The answer is both. I mean, clearly from the survey responses there, you see a mixture of both. And that, I think, has in large part to do with both the size of the orgs that respond, and then also the kind of maturity level of where the SOC teams are at. In larger organizations where your surface area for risk is really well modeled out, a discrete threat hunting team, not only makes a lot of sense, but also adds a ton of value, and it's easy to quantify at that level too. But a bit down market from that, the discreteness of that threat hunting team is predicated more on the maturity of the org. Threat hunting being a function of that security team does may make sense in some spots for some orgs. Your threat hunting team's got to be plugged into the rest of the IT org to be able to handle this stuff effectively, right? So when they're coming up with hypotheses and then testing those against current state of the network, current state of what's being brought in from event logs and things like that, they have to be well plugged into that IT org to make sure that things are handled in an effective fashion. And you've also got to consider the threat hunting as a function works well after you have, and only after you've really organized and prioritized your data really well, right? So, if you've only got a couple of hours for this, they've got to be used really, really effectively. So, if step one of your threat hunting team is to boil the ocean and then step two is to threat hunt, you're never going to get to step two, right? So a lot of it has to do with how well everything is aligned in your SOC. So like, hey, are we getting data from every endpoint that we could possibly getting it from? Are we pulling in, from a domain tools perspective, like enriching proxy logs is what we like to do for our customers a lot of the time. So if those don't exist there, then that's something that might need to be looked at, right? Post that, I think the mindset and the methodology is key, right? There's so much data and noise, and as an industry, we aren't always giving our threat hunters the ability to filter and identify what's actionable very easily. So, good threat hunting can start with good info curation, right? And without that, you can often be chasing a tail. So, in some ways, it's less about defining the role of threat hunting, but more ensuring that the environment that they're operating in is set up in a way that prioritizes actionable data, right? So, less about carving out time specifically for it, although that is certainly advantageous if you have that. Although it's very, very rare that we hear our security professionals that we work with talk about all the free time they have. Making sure that you've got good baselines to do that type of anomaly hunting. Without the baselines that are there, the time you're going to spend hunting is pretty easily wasted.
Thank you very much. I think that kind of approach is reflected in some of the responses of the survey. If you read it, it's very interesting. May I hand over to Matt with ExtraHop? What's your take on that?
Yeah, very similar. Generally speaking, it's very dependent on the maturity level of the organization. Larger, well-funded organizations that are higher on the maturity spectrum have dedicated hunt teams and have a charter that aligns with that team, and very clear mandates and a very clear separation of role. In less mature shops, regardless of how big they are, how well funded they are, we see much more of a shared responsibility model in the SOC. And I don't know that this is necessarily a bad thing. I think that, again, going to that last section of the question, if we have management that's dedicated to the benefits and the outcomes of the hunt exercise, it's a very, very useful tool for a lot of different things, including general SOC analyst preparedness, situational awareness, and higher quality outputs in general. So the very act of hunting from an operational practice perspective is extremely valuable, and it's extremely valuable for hunters to not just be part of the dedicated hunt team. Now, that being said, I do think that, and to the sort of undertone of that last section of the question, it really does need acknowledgement and support from leadership in the SOC, because otherwise you're going to end up playing whack-a-mole like most SOCs do, because everybody's understaffed and sort of oversubscribed. And so we've seen some interesting variations on that theme, that specific theme with management and leadership, where we've had CISOs have sort of dedicated hunt exercises that spread throughout the SOC with various sort of capture the flag style prizes at the end. And so they kind of gamified it, and they tied it to all sorts of internal status and cred and things like that, which was really refreshing, and I thought quite innovative, because they were able to stripe the operational practice across a broader audience inside the SOC.
May I just ask you one additional question regarding the CTF? Did they also plant some stuff that the hunters could find?
No, so it wasn't a formal CTF. It wasn't artificial in that way. It was very interesting. Her opinion on it was like, look, there are plenty of things to be identified and captured, and let's identify the highest quality ones. And it was quite effective according to to her report, at least. Yeah.
Sounds very interesting. So to summarize, you say the threat hunters do benefit from having worked in different roles. So I totally agree with that. But they still need dedicated time because otherwise they just jump between roles and start playing whack-a-mole, right?
Absolutely right. That's right.
So thank you very much for that. Handing over to Alex with ThreatConnect.
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with a lot of what Taylor and Matt said, and I think it's clear that the value of threat intelligence and threat hunting in particular has been more and more widely recognized by different types of security teams, different organizations of various sizes, industries, et cetera. And we're kind of getting the sense that everybody wants to hunt, which is great, but it's still fairly uncommon for me, at least, to run into teams that have dedicated threat hunters. Most folks out there are wearing multiple hats, like we've been talking about, and so I think predominantly we're seeing threat hunting as a function of security, but one that's getting a lot of attention. So I expect to see more dedicated roles and teams in the future, as Matt suggested earlier. Now, in terms of finding time for proactive hunting, there are two approaches that I can think of, and they're not mutually exclusive. Number one, I would try to integrate as much of the hunting process as you can into your day-to-day processes and even technology so that you kind of have a head start on your hunting tasks when you can carve out some time for them. So if you're spending the majority of your time triaging alerts, for example, use a system to track the outcomes of those alerts and tie them back to any signatures or detections that you use in your hunting. In other words, save the hunting related artifacts of your quote unquote day job that will help you hunt when you have time for it. So the goal here is to have those non-hunting operations inform your hunting tasks so you can be more effective when you do have that precious time for hunting. And if you can automate some or most of that, that's even better. So going back to the alert triage example, if you're seeing multiple false positives that are associated to a particular signature or detection, it's a good idea to track that information so that your hunting rules can be prioritized or adjusted appropriately. I don't want to spend precious time on things that match a noisy YAR rule until that rule has been tightened up. And number two, I think we're going to come back to this probably, so I'll just give a short version of it. You got to find ways to demonstrate the value and the impact of that threat hunting, as we've already alluded to. And that should lead your organization to dedicate more resources to that activity or team if you've got one.
Okay, thank you very much. So you don't see very many dedicated threat hunters yet, and I think that's supported by the survey as well. So we see the number is growing, but we're not where we should be right now, maybe. I do like the idea of storing what you do on your day job and using it for your hunting sessions, and I think that's the way to go, right? Taking whatever you get from your day job and taking it into hunting if you are not in a dedicated hunting role. So thank you very much. With that, I hand over to Josh and question number 2.
Thanks, Matt. So moving on to our next question. So just to set a little bit of context and provide a little bit of detail behind what comes out of the survey and our report that Matt and I have put together, just as we lead into the next question. So we asked respondents as part of the survey component, what activities would initiate an active threat hunt inside their environment. And you can see that the one that comes out on the top is anomalies picked up by our environment. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a broad answer that a lot of respondents gave here, but these anomalies could vary from anomalies based on alerts that are coming out of their alerting system to various other telemetry as well inside the environment. And then the next two that we kind of see sitting at just over 67 and just over 65% there is the first one being around threat intelligence from a third-party source. And the other one, which is also very similar to this one, is items or events we've read or heard about through peer groups and the media. And again, this is another form of sort of collecting intel and curating that yourself versus sort of that coming from a third party. So we're seeing things like those anomalies picked up inside the environment through telemetry or through alerting platforms that might exist. And then we're seeing that sort of source of threat intelligence being used to kick off active hunts inside the environment. The fourth one, which I'll speak to, and then I'll sort of move on to the next piece of detail before we jump into this question, is that new vulnerabilities found in the environment help kick off threat hunts. And this is an important one, because one thing that some organizations kind of miss here is that if a new vulnerability is found, then there's potentially exploitation of that vulnerability, which also needs to be looked at. So that's also one of the sort of fourth thing that people start to use to kick off those active threat hunts inside their environment. The other piece of detail here, as a bit of a reminder, is what actions should be included into organizations' definition of threat hunting. So what are the things that organizations should use as part of that threat hunting and be used to pull together that methodology and that approach that they're doing? And then overwhelmingly, we saw people indicate that indicators of compromise to find adversary tools are part of one of those key things. And some of the stuff that Matt and I spoke about yesterday is that's probably not unexpected at this stage. We know that indicators of compromise have been heavily relied on by incident responders. We also see that incident responders make up a large component of people who are threat hunters, or the skills of requirement for people to go into threat hunting as well. And given that sort of come from that history of incident response, it kind of makes sense why that is so heavily relied on as one of those key things that are used by organizations as part of performing threat hunting. My apologies. So that was kind of interesting to see that pulled out. And the other one, which came in only just behind that, was using threat intelligence such as adversaries' TTP, so their tactics, techniques, and procedures, to basically build hypotheses around where attackers may be found in the environment. And this is where we sort of strongly push people to go with threat hunting, and where you start to find really interesting things is where you start to use that hypothesis-based hunting. And that kind of leads us into our second question for the panel here. So the question being is, the survey that has come out indicates that over half of respondents use IOCs, or indicators of compromise, or alerts to kick off threat hunting exercises, which somewhat undercuts the potential of true proactive hypothesis-driven threat hunting. What are some best practices for generating threat hunting hypotheses without starting from an IOC or detection? And to start us off, I'm going to hand over to Matt from ExtraHop. So Matt, tell us what are some of the best ways or practices for generating a threat hunting hypothesis without starting from an IOC or detection?
I'm glad I'm going first on this, because I would suspect most of us will give a similar answer. If you just go back to the CIS control framework, section 1, all of it is predicated on a strong foundation of understanding and visibility in the environment. And that visibility is usually, it's usually centered around, we might expand the scope of it a little bit. It's usually centered around the assets. And we would expand that in the case of threat hunting beyond just security controls and understanding the assets in the environment, whether it's inside the data center perimeter or part of the broader ecosystem. It's understanding the disposition, the services, and the service level behaviors of those assets. And so all of this, to me, really coalesces down to, do you have, and it's kind of a binary question, do you have a strong foundational sort of a visibility framework available to you in the SOC? If the answer is no, then you're fighting with one hand tied behind your back, just by definition, and which goes clearly beyond the confines of just threat hunting. But we're really talking about you need mechanisms to speculatively interact with data. and that data needs to support a hypothesis up or down. And then we'll get to this later, I'm sure, but that the outputs of that exercise, given the right visibility framework, has this really, really powerful sort of virtuous cycle effect where you're able to carry those insights forward into other areas of the practice. So for me, it really does boil down to visibility. We typically define it across 3 dimensions, and this perhaps might be valuable to some of the listeners. From a visibility perspective, and visibility clearly has implications for your detection strategy, your controls, and beyond, right? It's typically comprised of solid, endpoint EDR, the SIM, network, and between those 3 sort of axes and other sort of strategic points of visibility and / control in your environment, there's a very, very short list of assets which you can rely on that will really hyper accelerate the practice of hunting and the outputs of those hunt exercises. Because if you think about just scope it to EDR, SIM, and network, those 3 data sources cover each other's gaps very, very well. The network will leave off where the endpoint picks up, and vice versa, for example. And so when you're able to sort of cross-reference these different vectors of data and insight and context, you're really, really able to get meaningful tests against the hypothesis and take those tests as deep as one needs based on what you're looking for, right? And where the boundary of one thing stops and the other one starts. And so we really emphasize at ExtraHop the 3 pillars of visibility, which would be SIM, EDR, and NDR, network detection and response. So between those 3, it's the Pareto's law, the 20% of visibility that gives you 80+% of your value. That's the real win from our perspective.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. That rings true even in some of the results that we've seen as well around where people are trying to automate pulling that data from and where they're finding that useful data from as well. So that's really good. We'll move on to Alex from ThreatConnect. Alex, what is it that you're sort of seeing from your side in terms of some of those best practices in this space?
Yeah, Matt had me worried for a second there, but I have a different take on this. Probably because my team focuses mostly on open source intelligence research and analysis. So I'm glad we've got different perspectives here. It's always great when you can learn as a panelist too. So thanks. I think a good way to think about it for me is to use this is a pretty well-known concept, but David Bianco's pyramid of pain. And just real quick, if you're not familiar, this is just a diagram shaped like a triangle or a pyramid with about 6 different sections. Each section represents a category of items that we use as defenders, or that we use them to identify and disrupt or frustrate the adversary or cause pain, right? And they're ordered from most painful at the top to least painful at the bottom. And the reason for the pyramid shape is that the largest section at the bottom, which is file hashes, those are easy to identify and plentiful, right? It's a big section. The other things at the bottom sections are IP addresses and domain names, other ephemeral indicators, so to speak. And at the very top, the little triangle, the tip, you have TTPs or attack patterns. And so if you can identify the adversary's attack patterns and use those to disrupt their attacks or campaigns, you'll be more effective. So that's the pyramid of pain. And to put that into context to answer the question, hopefully, I want to base my proactive hunting efforts on hypotheses that are kind of grounded in the top half of that pyramid, not the bottom half. I don't want to base my hunting on IP addresses or domains that change quickly or become less relevant very quickly, because then we're back to the classic game of whack-a-mole. Instead, I want to enrich those indicators, learn more about the domain registrants and the certificates used and the name servers used, maybe even use those to pivot out and repeat the process and build a sample of artifacts, and then I can step back and look and say, okay, I think this threat is consistently using this attack pattern. Now, how can I translate that to a signature or a detection and hunt in a way that will be more impactful?
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks very much for that, Alex. And I mean, what you're saying there with that pyramid of pain, that's exactly right. And also to kind of add to that, and we've put a little bit of this in the report as well, is to keep in mind that those indicators which are sort of further down in that period, like at the bottom of the period, at the pyramid, they often age out very quickly or become less useful very quickly in time. So I mean, what you're sort of saying there is exactly right. Like sticking to those top ones is where you sort of see that high value as well. So that's excellent. So we'll move on to Taylor from Domain Tools. So Taylor, what's your sort of take on this in terms of some of the best practices for generating these threat hunting hypotheses without starting from IOCs or detection?
Yeah, I will say it's really tough to go after these two. But I probably tend to approach this, closer to Alex. We're also dealing with a lot of OSINT here at Domain Tools. And some of this, making sure that we're ensuring our IOCs are accurate and make sense for the landscape that we're looking at, right? And so, where a single domain may be pretty ephemeral, like a screenshot of that domain that gives you a better intelligence about what their vector might be can help you kind of plan and understand what they're after a little bit better. Specifically looking like phishing campaigns, right? So if they're trying to phish your customers, if they're trying to phish your employees, what specific employees are they trying to phish? I think at some point we're starting to realize that we're all a part of each other's supply chain. And so, taking a look at it from that angle can be really helpful. Viewing it in the context of geopolitical events too is also pretty helpful. But for example, hey, I've got an interesting domain. Now this itself may be ephemeral, but the screenshot of that domain tells me that they're targeting like a third-party vendor of mine. Understanding really well what level of access that third-party vendor might have at my organization and what other third-party vendors have a similar level of access, because ultimately they don't really care about, the adversaries don't care about the specific third-party vendor, they care about the access that they're able to gain, right? So if they can't get that leverage from one specific target, they'll keep trying again. And so, learning both from what is given to me from a single IOC, if that's where I'm starting my hunt from, and then pivoting out from there, but also looking at what's happening in my industry at large, right? So, if a competitor of mine is targeted in a way, then I need to keep an eye on that and be aware of the changes in that landscape. So mapping your vendor landscape, knowing your business relationships really well. I think even in the survey, it mentions that the Verizon De Beer pegged phishing is probably the easiest way to get in an organization, right? So, knowing that the easiest way to get into my organization is probably sitting in front of a keyboard at that organization, and ensuring that I've got a high level of visibility, making sure that I'm capturing all the different vectors that might come in line with that.
Yeah, that's great, and I really like that in terms of what you mentioned there around sort of looking at those vendors, and if you end up as part of someone else's supply chain attack, or all those vendors that may form part of your supply chain attack as well. That's actually a really nice sort of hypothesis-driven type of theory you can go after there from a hunting perspective, which is very cool. All right, we'll thank you to Matt, Alex, and Taylor with that question. For the next one, I'll hand back over to Matt to take us through a bit more detail and look at the last question.
Thank you very much, Josh. So let's go to question number 3. And to me personally, it's one of the most complex ones. I see that in our organization as well. Threat hunting is quite hard to measure, right? Are you having made any improvements? Do you spend your money well? How is that looking for our respondents? So the responses that we got showed that a quarter of all the respondents did not really know if there was any use to threat hunting, if it brought any measurable improvement. But on the other end of the spectrum, we had 12% that said, well, we had an improvement of more than 50%. More than 50%, that indicates that you can basically measure improvement in some sort of numbers. And that's really difficult, because what we see a lot out there is that security is measured in quantities rather than in quality oftentimes. Like, okay, this organization has twice as much IOCs than the other one, so they're probably better, which is not necessarily true, right? And the same goes for that. Just because threat hunting does not find many breaches does not really mean they're bad. Maybe there were no breaches in the time of the hunt. That's also possible. So let's get down into the numbers a little bit more. So how are the organizations that are able to measure the benefits of threat hunting, what exactly improves for them? And there's a lot of data on this one slide, so let's focus only on a few, especially on the significant improvements over 30%, and that should be only 3 points there. And the top winner here with 36.3% is the creation of more robust detections and better coverage. And that's something that we also pointed out yesterday in yesterday's webcast, that one of the huge benefits of threat hunting is that you see where you're lacking visibility and you can improve your coverage with that. Obviously, and I think that's also something that goes back to question number 1 today, it's also possible to create better detections and circle back what you learned from threat hunting into your SOC operations and vice versa. So we'll look at the numbers. Number 2 here is reducing the attack surface and exposure, meaning you harden the network. So threat hunting might also help you to reduce your exposure by finding stuff and well, getting rid of it and hardening the systems against it. And the last one, over 30% with significant improvements, is the creation of more accurate detections. Because what you do in threat hunting can eventually go over into your SOC operations, and in that regard help to reduce false positives. And I think that leads right into our next questions. So what are the measures of success for you around threat hunting? And we start with Alex this time.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I think the survey did a great job of laying out some good examples, as we saw on that slide. A couple of them that resonate with me are dwell time or time to detection, and maybe attack surface exposure, which I interpret more generally as maybe like countermeasures enabled or mitigations implemented. And Matt, you also mentioned something really important, which I think you can think of it like shrinking the size of your unknown unknowns, right? So like if you uncover something that you previously didn't know, that's really useful to track and to measure. But rather than talk about specific measures too much, I wanted to share some thoughts around metrics and that, you know, phrase measures of success. This is something that my team has spent a lot of time on, and if you were at the SANS CTI Summit in January of this year, you might have seen some of my colleagues give a presentation called How to Get Promoted, Developing Metrics to Show How Threat Intel Works. I believe you can find that video still on the SANS DFIR YouTube channel if you're interested. So shameless plug there, but it's SANS, so it should be okay, right? Yeah, I'll talk about a couple of the concepts from that presentation as they apply here. I think most of us that have had to implement metrics around security processes have probably encountered both the good and bad varieties of metrics. Sometimes you just look back on the quarter or the year and realize, wow, this chart doesn't tell me anything, or it's not showing me if there's a real impact, or maybe I wasn't really able to measure the thing that I said was going to be a metric. So we want to distinguish good measures of success versus bad measures of success. So it's important to focus on metrics that are clear, measurable, and that correlate to business outcomes. Also, we want to stay away from just creating metrics because there's a thing that you can count and a pretty dashboard to graph it. You want to measure impact, not output. Another way of thinking about this is to distinguish between something called measures of performance and measures of effectiveness. So like MOPs and MOEs. They're not new or anything. It's a system that's been used by the US military for many years. And the difference between these two is that measures of performance are used to measure task completion and efficiency, whereas measures of effectiveness are used to determine whether goals are being met. So measures of performance will tell me, am I doing things right? And measures of effectiveness will tell me, am I doing the right things? So there's utility in both of them. Tracking measures of performance, such as total number of alerts or IOCs ingested, those can be useful in determining things like the health of your automated components and help you improve those processes. But these are typically pretty tactical, and they're generally less useful for senior leadership, right? On the other hand, measures of effectiveness, such as mean time to detection or even something like revenue saved, might be a little more challenging to set those up, but those are great at helping you understand if you're doing the right things, and also hopefully conveying program value and helping you demonstrate how threat hunting actually deserves resources.
Oh, that's a very good approach. So what I take from that is that it's probably a good idea to measure the impact on the organization rather than just pure numbers in the process. And I totally like that approach. So may I hand over to Taylor? What's your take?
Yeah, actually, that was really well covered there. You know, kind of a few things in addition is you know, making sure we're correlating our existing alerting systems around true positives. So trying to drive to that as much as possible and minimizing noise. You know, you're not always going to get as close to that as you want to get to. But you know, with the long run goal of getting to as many true positives as possible, trying to filter that down. You know, when you do have a detection, like what is your time to containment on that? Like how quickly are you able to corral these types of things? That's definitely something that's measurable. And when it comes to, you know, basing, like let's say you are a threat hunter that's also sharing, you know, wearing that security architect hat as well. You know, patch times, and also kind of mitigating potential chain effects on different vulnerabilities is also really helpful. And then, you know, from our side at Domain Tools, hey, you know, once you've identified a threat, how much of that threat infrastructure are you able to identify and block? How much are you able to kind of roll up when you're hunting out in the wild, you know, kind of beyond your network? And then how much of that are you able to effectively monitor? You know, that's a little bit trickier these days, but you know, how much are you able to, how much activity are you able to pick up in as close to kind of real time as possible, like in terms of like, hey, you know, did we pick up that phishing domain close to its create date? That would be a nice thing that would be helpful to measure. You know, and again, trying to drive that down to the true positives and filter out the noise as much as possible.
So basically, I think that works pretty well for SOC as well. I think that there might be overlaps with that. So maybe we can leverage that in the future more. Thank you very much, Taylor. Matt, what's your take?
Well, a lot of it's been said, although for me, I think about it a little bit more on the upstream side. Let's assume for a minute, actually, let's put some constraints around my answer. So let's assume that we have a dedicated hunt team, regardless of its size or the size of the organization. So we have a dedicated team, and that team is going to engage in the hunt exercise and produce various types of outputs. I was super, super encouraged, you guys, by the results of the survey that you just showed, because the outputs of the hunt exercise really do spread into many different facets of the practice, from a control perspective, from an assessment implementation perspective of the controls, from a detection perspective, as we've already covered, all of the sort of virtuous cycle of threat hunting as an operational practice. It should feed the beast of all of these other disciplines. So the outputs, for me, it really does start with the outputs. But as was so adroitly said earlier, going back to the MOE discussion, you know, measuring those outputs that's the sort of last mile challenge here. It's one thing to focus on the outputs and share this information and to be able to demonstrate you've got better situational awareness, say, and better environmental awareness. That awareness very directly translates to, at least one can instinctively infer, right? It directly translates to better coverage, smarter detections, better controls, faster IR timelines. And so right away, those outputs, that's the fertile ground for actual units of measurement, I would say. Am I responding more quickly from an IR, just adjudicating any given event up or down? Am I doing that more quickly than I used to do, yes or no? and down the line from a controls perspective, compliance, understanding. So it's been very, very well covered, but I really do want to reiterate that an overly linear interpretation of threat hunting will sabotage its value, because to me, threat hunting is a lot like the DevOps movement. It really represents an operational practice change that has outputs that benefit many, many different downstream practices. So.
Yeah, I also believe that there is a lot of benefit by proxy in that regard, and I think we sort of try to depict that at least a little bit when it comes to the relation between SOC, threat hunting, and incident response. We have that on page 7, I believe, in the threat hunting survey. So I totally agree that we can also measure that by output and benefit for the other parts of the organization. Thanks very much for that. So I think we're finished with the questions. I hand over to Josh for this little wrap up.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thank you all to our panelists as well, and for everyone sort of attending today. So this is just another reminder that we did do a webcast yesterday, which went through the report and some really interesting parts that Matt and I managed to pull out of the survey overall, and sort of talking through some of the things that we're seeing in the industry at the moment, and also looking at some of the things we've seen over time. One of the key things we started to look at with the report as well is we went through and tried to take a lot of the statistics that we had over the last couple of years. So the SANS team were very helpful in sort of providing those statistics from the last year. And we've tried to give weave that at least into the report this year to sort of look at what's happening over time in this space of threat hunting, and also how people are changing methodologies or changing how they work within the industry when it comes to threat hunting inside an organization as well. But if you want to have a look at that, there is the recording from yesterday. So the link is there, and it's also on the SANS website as well, along with the recording from today. So with that, I'll hand back over to Carol, who's going to, I believe, moderate some of our Q&A session, which would be wonderful.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We do have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenters, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first one asks, are threat and vulnerability management and threat hunting one of the same thing?
So I might jump into that from I guess sort of our perspective of what we see in the industry, and then also I guess sort of hand over to any of our panelists as well for this one. So I guess sort of threat and vulnerability management versus hunting are normally what we see in the industry is two different areas. Threat and vulnerability management is around sort of monitoring and looking for those vulnerabilities inside an organization, and then also the management of that around getting those vulnerabilities closed off so they are no longer a vulnerability. So that's traditionally what we see as threat and vulnerability management. And then threat hunting kind of sits a little bit differently. Threat hunting is more around trying to look at those areas in the organization where you don't have your traditional detection, or you don't have traditional telemetry that you can automate some type of alert. So that threat hunting is really going looking for those places where you have blind spots in the organization. That's where you get the large benefit for threat hunting. But there is a little bit of threat hunting that will go alongside of things like vulnerabilities, particularly when we look back and look at things like Eternal Blue, and when vulnerabilities like those come out, which are these huge sort of vulnerabilities which have massive impact in many organizations. You would use your threat hunters to go potentially looking for exploitation of those vulnerabilities, particularly if you don't have detection that will traditionally detect that. And a lot of places don't, because you're kind of talking about vulnerabilities which either are unknown, and if they were known, then we would have detections for those. But yeah, definitely you would use them both together, but they do form two slightly different roles. Your threat hunter would go looking for exploitation against a vulnerability, whereas your vulnerability management team traditionally do things like work with your vendors around patching, or work with internal departments around getting things patched, or at least mitigating the risk that a vulnerability might present. I guess with that question as well, I'll just hand over, I guess, quickly, is there anything else, Matt from Extra Hop, you kind of want to add to that?
No, that's a very useful, the analogy would be on the vulnerability management side is making sure the doors and windows are locked, and on the hunt side, you're looking for evidence of a break-in. I think that's exactly right.
Nice. And what about Alex from ThreatConnect? Any additional items you wanted to add to that one?
I don't think I can. I think that was a great answer.
Nice. And Taylor from Domain Tools.
No, good answer. I think, maybe the next step would be to think, okay, well, if someone did break in through that door or window, what's their next logical move at that point, right? Start to develop a hypothesis after assuming that vulnerability has been used, right? So where do they end up next in my network?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Excellent. Carol, how are we going? Any other questions there as well?
Yes, we do. Thanks. How do you demonstrate the benefits of threat hunting to non-IT people? For example, my boss.
Look, that's a good question and a hard one, I think. We saw this in the survey results in one of the graphs I think Matt had up there in that last question around measurable threat hunting and how you measure that and sort of show benefit from it. And we're seeing people struggle with that at the moment in the industry. I mean, the large overwhelming amount had that as well. So how do you show benefit to management? I guess a lot of this comes down to the explanation of what threat hunting is. And really, at the end of the day, threat hunting is supposed to be that process around covering the areas where you are blind with any tooling or telemetry you have. And so if you think about it from the perspective of we have some sort of alerting platform, a SIEM or whatever that might be, we have telemetry feeding that alerting platform as well. But there are going to be blind spots within your environment, and your threat hunters are the people who have to go looking in those parts of the environment. And the reality is, from the reports that we see from other industry professionals as well, is that adversaries stay in the environment for huge numbers of days. So we know that they are able to stay quiet inside the environment particularly well. And that's the challenge that we kind of have is being able to uncover those places where they are. So really, I guess a lot of this comes down to, I guess, sort of talking through this and sort of going, all right, well, we know we have good coverage here, but we need to spend some time looking at this part of the environment or this part of the network to make sure that we don't have anything horrible going on there. And that's really what your threat hunters are doing. They're skilled individuals that can go looking for those threats in these small pockets of the environment that you just don't have covered. So they act as sort of that human version of an alerting platform is the idea behind it. And I'll kind of change it order a little bit. Alex from ThreatConnect, is there anything else or any other detail you've kind of seen or seen other people do in terms of trying to work with leadership or upper management to convince them of this?
Yeah, no, I thought your points were very good, and I'd probably add and maybe just reiterate from before that at least from what we've seen, typically you want to stay away from getting too tactical with the metrics or with the reports that you put in front of your boss to demonstrate value of threat hunting, and maybe stick to the more strategic side. Typically that will read a little more easily to a non-technical audience.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what about Taylor over at Domain Tools? Is there any sort of recommendations you have or any good practices you've seen where people have kind of sold this concept to leadership?
It's a tricky one because so much of it is kind of trying to quantify those unknown unknowns. To the extent that you're able to build up metrics that support the operations that your team are putting together, you've got to again hone in on where you're where you're able to perform hey, these are the blocking rules that we added. Here are attacker TTPs that we put together. Trying to help quantify what you're up to, and that can always help when you interface with management.
Yeah, that's right. And we do try to give a little bit of a simple example after this section in the actual report around how about going to try and measure what you're doing with threat hunting as well. So there's a little bit of detail of that in the report as well to help people who are struggling with that sort of metric around measuring and showing that benefit to it, to try and give you something to present to leadership. And then Matt over at Extra Hop, what about from your side? Anything that you've sort of seen, any good tactics that you've seen in terms of trying to communicate this to leaders?
Yeah, and I'll put aside the measurement for a minute and talk more on the spectrum of persuasion. For me, if it were my pitch to give to a less technical senior audience, I would very quickly swan dive into the horrifying numbers that dwell time. It's increasing. I think the last one, it was up around 104 days, depending on which survey you're paying attention to. So dwell time is holding steady at best and increasing at worst. So what does that mean? Well, that means attackers are, as we've mentioned before, attackers are sitting there undetected doing things in your environment. And so now, how does one, just rhetorically, how does one expect to skin that cat? Because if traditional detection methods, as opposed to like empirical analytics and speculative interaction / hunting with your data, if absent those approaches, we've already established that traditional methods haven't solved this problem. Now, that's not to say detections aren't good, they're wonderful, but we need more. And I would also point to risk, because again, the outputs of hunting as a discipline have many, many benefits downstream. So I would point to risk, I would point to dwell time. And then lastly, the entire discussion we're having right now around like a new trend in the SOC, in a new role that has spawned in the SOC, was spawned for a reason. Threat hunting was spawned for a reason. It's because of these other factors that we've already talked about. So that's what that's the pitch I would give, or some variation of it.
Yeah, I do like that too, in terms of using those metrics that exist at the moment out in the industry too. And also to kind of to reinforce what you're sort of saying there, is that also what we see in other reports and other metrics that come out is that if you have internal teams detect malicious activity, you actually detect it much faster as well, compared to if you're relying on third parties or outside sources to assist you with that type of detection. So it is kind of shown in the numbers that we see over time that the more you can find through your own internal teams or your own internal knowledge or internal telemetry, you actually find those adversaries quicker. Unfortunately, you are exactly right. It's in the quantities of large numbers of days. It's not going to be minutes or hours, unfortunately. And initially, that's why we have this concept of threat hunting to cover those gaps as well.
I think we've got a lot of. Sorry, Josh, but I just wanted to add one thing. I think what also helps nowadays is media attention. So you get a lot of media attention for all of those ransomware cases, and even though they're not usually the most complex kind of cases, they make the concept of dwell time very visible also to non-technical leaders, because what you can show them clearly in many of those cases is that the attackers, if it was like Fin6 or Samsam or whatever, that they have been in a network for quite some time, and only right in the end of the attack they start encrypting stuff. So you would have had like weeks or even months before they did that. And that's more transparent than like all of those cases that are undercover, that never go to the media, where the attackers have been in there long enough and then exfiltrated something. Nowadays we have companies that are in a standstill, that lose a lot of money just because no one was looking at what's going on in the network for a couple of weeks. And I think that's a very non-technical argument for that.
Excellent.
All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Matthias, Josh, Matt, Alex, and Taylor, for your great presentation, and to Domain Tools, Extra Hop, and ThreatConnect for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.